So recently I was reading The Golden Spoon by Jessa Maxwell. This book follows 6 different baking contestants on a reality TV show. Eventually there's a murder and it also becomes a little bit of a murder mystery. I don't really want to focus on that part of the book though. I want to focus on the fact that this book at 288 pages included 7 different perspectives. And it kind of got me thinking about multiple perspective stories, books that follow different viewpoints as we go through the story, whether it be in first person directly, as was the case of this book, or a third person perspective, but kind of following around different characters throughout the book. This has definitely become very common, and sometimes I really like it and I think it works, and sometimes it doesn't. In this book in particular, you would assume it wouldn't work because 7 perspectives in 288 pages seems a little bit ridiculous to some. That being said, the characters were cartoonishly stereotypical, but it kind of worked for what this book was. This is following a reality TV show. If you think of an actual baking reality TV show, oftentimes contestants are picked specifically to be a little bit stereotypical and to be foils to each other. So because we were kind of copying sort of a format that is already a little bit surface level in a certain type of way, it kind of worked in the book. Also, when you think about the reason for reading a cozy mystery, it's going to be a different reason for most people than another type of book or genre. It worked for me partially because I was in this to have fun, and it was fun. Recently, I also read a fantasy book, a very long fantasy book, that used the multiple perspective format as well. In this book, it didn't work. I don't want to say the name of the book because it's a very, very small book with almost no following, and I don't really like critiquing books that have little to no following in public. That being said, this book followed so many different perspectives, but each perspective felt exactly the same, and only differences between perspectives were things that felt very over the top, stereotypical, and because it was so in your face, it felt like the author's points he was trying to make through the use of a fantasy story didn't feel very subtle. I ended up not finishing that book because I could not handle how this author handled the multiple perspective format because I did not think he did a very good job. Between my different reactions to these different reads, I realized that my own view on the multiple perspective format is a little bit complicated, and it definitely depends on the type of book that is being written, the purpose of the book, and how I feel about the quality of the writing. I didn't think I was alone in this though, so I asked my audience members what they thought of multiple perspectives. I received many comments, and we're going to go through some of those and just kind of think about what makes a multiple perspective book work and what doesn't make it work. Some people focused on suspense. One reader mentioned that a recent read of theirs took the suspense out of the book because it used multiple perspectives. They said, "That being said, there are also books where the main character, and by extension the reader, don't know things, and the book is more enjoyable if the twist doesn't get spoiled or interrupted by other POVs. As an example, there was a book I was reading. It was a contemporary romance where the male main character had a secret child, and we found out before the female main character. I think it would have been a better twist if we didn't have his POV." I think that is a fair critique in this circumstance. Imagining a contemporary romance where the man in the relationship has a secret child and he did not disclose this to the woman in the relationship, that is a big thing if you think about it from a perspective of dating someone. So the fact that the readers found out before the female main character takes away some of the intensity of the moment. Likely the reader already has the justification from the man's eyes and already is kind of wanting to glaze over the whole confrontation because they know more than the female main character does, making the whole thing a lot less of a moment than it would have been otherwise. It would make the reader want the whole thing to resolve quickly because they aren't really in the moment with the situation. I agree that that would be a situation where the suspense is almost taken out of the story because you were using this multiple perspective format. Another comment, though, a contrasting example to this, talked about how the multiple perspective format can be used to add intrigue or suspense if done in a different way. They said, "More often than not, I prefer single POV. However, for certain kinds of books, multiple POVs can be made to work really well. One of my favorite writers is Christopher Priest, most known for The Prestige, the book that was adapted into the Hugh Jackman Christian Bale film. His novels tend to have a recurring motif of duplicates, twins, or people living parallel or entwined lives. He uses the multiple POV to create a kind of cognitive estrangement in the reader, where you doubt what really happened in a scene because the two characters saw it unfold differently. For another example, I recently read a contemporary slipstream novel called The Anomaly, in which a plane and its passengers get duplicated after going through a storm. Then the multiple POVs are not just the passengers, but of their duplicates. Multiple POVs can be a very effective tool when used like this." I'm a big personal fan of the multiple POV being used for this sort of purpose, especially when he was talking in the first situation about maybe having some unreliable narrators, as you see the same scene unfold differently from different perspectives, adding a lot of confusion and intrigue for the reader, but in a good way. I think these are really good examples for showing how multiple POVs can be used to add suspense if it fits the story that you are creating. Another commenter talked of another use of multiple perspectives that I believe sounds like an effective use of it, even though I haven't read the book, that isn't really in that sci-fi realm, but is in more of a historical fiction piece. To understand this comment, you do need to know a word, so this is a book channel. There's education sometimes. Vivisection, the action of cutting, surgery, or other invasive treatment of a living organism for the purposes of physiological or pathological scientific investigation. So, surgery on someone for the purpose of science, not for the purpose of helping that person. Comment. Overall, I find that multiple points of view can really enrich a story when they are well thought out and differentiated. For example, a novel I read at the beginning of the year is Shusaku Endo's The Sea and Poison. The story recounts how during World War II, Japanese doctors participated in vivisections on American prisoners. Having multiple narrators here makes the story more dramatic and personal than a neutral third-person narrative. We gradually discover the plot through their eyes, which allows us to better understand each character's motivations and contradictions. The order of the point of view also makes sense. It is by bringing them together that we get an overview of the situation, keeping some suspense. The rhythm of the story, however, is never broken. The transitions are very smooth. Conversely, in a contemporary novel I read recently, the different points of view didn't seem useful to me. The characters all had the same way of thinking and speaking with no real personal motivation, so the change in POV ultimately added nothing to the story. Maybe this is the biggest challenge, a coherent story with different and individual voices. First of all, I want to say that that book sounds fascinating, and I can imagine how the use of multiple perspectives in this historical fiction piece really adds something to what you're getting as a reader. You're having people in these positions of performing surgery on other people for the sake of science and not for the well-being of the patients. Well, they're not patients if it's for science. You have to have an internal framework that you can make work for that. You have to have a certain way of thinking, and getting into the heads of different people involved in that would be interesting, because I imagine that different people would have a different way of justifying that action to themselves. So adding in those perspectives probably adds in texture to the story in a way you would not have if you were following everyone from a third-person perspective where you don't actually have their feelings. And the fact that the commenter contrasted this example with a contemporary book that they didn't feel needed multiple perspectives is sort of the heart of what I'm feeling as well. when it has a purpose, it can be amazing. But when we're just adding it in because it's becoming popular to have multiple perspectives, it can fall pretty flat if there's not enough differences between the characters that we are following. And a lot of people focused on the fact that every voice needs to feel distinct when you are using multiple perspectives. Many comments actually talked about how they do not like the usage of putting the name of the character you're following in the next chapter as a chapter heading. One comment said, "I actually kind of prefer multiple POV novels. It's a neat puzzle for me to figure out what's happening and why, and I love the insight it offers into characters' motivations. That being said, I also judge authors heavily on their skill by whether or not they feel the need to put the character's name at the top of the chapter. In my opinion, if you feel the need to do that, you have not developed the right skills to write a multiple POV book, especially one written in first person, which is where I see this the most. I also use the character POV as chapter header judgment to determine how much the author trusts, and by some extension respects, their audience." I kind of sort of agree with the sentiment without fully agreeing with the conclusion. The chapters in a multiple POV book should feel so distinct because they are different characters with different backgrounds and different motivations and different ways of seeing the world, and their speech patterns should even be different. So there shouldn't be a need to put the character name at the beginning of the chapter, because when you're reading a couple paragraphs at the beginning of the chapter, it should become immediately apparent if it is well written. I do also like the idea of an author respecting the audience's intelligence. I don't think authors should ever simplify their language in order to dumb down a book so that the masses can engage with a book. You should respect the intelligence of the person picking up your book and do exactly what you want to do without needing to make those adjustments. That being said, I don't have the pet peeve that she has. I don't mind at all when a book has a chapter heading that is the character's name. It shouldn't need it, but if it's there, I kind of see it more as like an organizational thing. I also obviously throw tons of random headings on a lot of my videos. I don't think I will on this one, but I think it's okay as just like a visual organizational thing throughout the book. So the act itself doesn't bother me, but the need to do it is definitely a problem. Your characters should be distinct enough to where you don't have to do it. You just choose to do it for organizational purposes, which I'm fine with. Some people think that the choice of multiple POV versus single POV should have to do something with the scope of the book. Some people focused on geographical scope. One comment said, "I generally prefer multiple POVs as long as it's justified. It doesn't make a ton of sense for the book to have multiple POVs if it's from characters that are almost constantly together." I'm reading one of those right now. If it's multiple POVs because the characters are separated by distance and they end up having completely different storylines that eventually come together to form a whole, it makes the book's world feel more complete and filled out. I think that this is very common, especially with a lot of epic fantasy books that have multiple POVs. Think like Game of Thrones or The Way of Kings, or a lot of those really popular epic fantasy books right now, is oftentimes the people are in different geographical locations experiencing completely different stories, and then throughout the series they come closer and closer together to be in a similar story. And needing multiple POVs for that totally makes sense. And this reader also kind of thinks that when that isn't the case, it shouldn't be a multiple POV story. If everyone's in the same room, they feel that it's just unnecessary at that point. I don't know if that's always true. I think it can be. I think it can become pretty repetitive, and we'll get into a comment that kind of talks about that in a minute. Thinking about the previous examples in this video, though, I imagine a lot of the doctors in that book with the Japanese vivisection on prisoners were probably in the same room, but seeing different moral frameworks for how they handled doing something that I would consider atrocious would be interesting, even if they're geographically together. Or some of those mind-bendy, sci-fi things, thriller things that the other commenter mentioned. Seeing the same scene from multiple perspectives, but having someone or multiple people be unreliable narrators could definitely be interesting, even if they're geographically together. So I understand where this comment is definitely coming from. I think that if you are all in the same room, seeing different perspectives, you have to add something beyond just surface level characters. It needs to be something else. There needs to be texture to it, like in the examples that were mentioned earlier in the video. There's another comment that focused on scope, but instead of geographical scope, they kind of were more focused on what is the purpose of the book. Let me read this comment. I think it all boils down to what the author is trying to explore. Is it one character's growth or descent, or is it a bigger systemic question they want to address? If it's the latter, sometimes multiple POVs are needed. I think it's hard to maintain more than 2 or 3, but it depends on the author's skill. One novel where multiple POVs were introduced late in the novel and I found them unnecessary was Flesh by David Saleh, which is a novel exploring one character's growth and descent through the lens of toxic masculinity. I could immediately think of ways in which those short alternative POVs could have been skipped or rephrased from the protagonist's perspective. I agree that it would probably feel a little jarring and weird to all of a sudden add multiple perspectives into a book that is meant to get really internally into the brain of one person. I mean, in this case, we're talking about a book where the point is one individual's experience getting into some form of toxic masculinity. I haven't read it, so I don't know anything about the book, but that is a very internal experience where you're getting into the brain of one person, and adding in other perspectives, it would be kind of weird. I think I would generally agree that it does depend on the scope of what the author is trying to make commentary on. If you're trying to focus on the personal, it could be kind of tough to do that with adding multiple perspectives. If you're trying to focus more on like a societal level or trying to get like a broader scope to what your story is covering, that is kind of probably where multiple perspectives make a lot more sense. Rather than focusing on scope of the story, many people focused on how one perspective can end up being a lot more entertaining than the other ones. You might have had the experience where you're reading a book that has multiple perspectives and you almost get annoyed when a certain person comes up, or you're waiting for the one perspective that's actually interesting. There's quite a few comments about this. One is sort of like a writer-focused comment thinking about the pitfalls that can happen and what needs to be avoided. He said, whatever form a multi-viewpoint narrative is in, there's 3 big pitfalls in my opinion. Quality disparity between viewpoints. A reader's preference is not always in the writer's control, but we've all read books that we groan when it is insert boring or annoying characters chapter. I sometimes assign more blame to the author because it is clear they want to explore a theme or set this character up for something later, but fail to make them entertaining now. Mental load. Even with the smartest target audience, there is a limit to the amount of information you expect them to hold, which leads to the last pitfall, pacing issues. The more viewpoints you have, the more demand there is to make each scene have significant plot progression. So the writer either has to push out character scenes, which will cause a drop in reader engagement, or keep them in, but story progresses at a snail's pace, again, causing a drop in reader engagement. I think that this is an interesting comment because I agree that there seems to be multiple POV books where there are pacing issues because you're adding in so many characters, but there's not always something interesting to happen to every character, even if there's a plan for them in the future. Meaning you're going to just add in a chapter so that we remember they exist, but you either have to make up some sort of drama or you just have a really boring chapter, leading to certain chapters for a certain amount of time being a lot more interesting because that's where the action is. I think the connection between having too many POVs that you aren't tracking perfectly and pacing issues definitely makes sense to me. Some people have mentioned that switching viewpoints can be jarring when authors rely too much on cliffhangers to build suspense. One comment said, I always sigh a bit when I open a book and realize it's multiple POV. I find them jarring. They pull me out of the story, especially when authors build up to a pivotal moment and then switch perspectives. I know it's supposed to keep us in suspense, but I usually find it annoying and it makes me lose interest in the story. And I'd just like to point out one annoying thing with this technique, and that's filling your book with cliffhangers. There's no better way to make me not want to pay attention to person B than switching to person B right after a huge cliffhanger on person A. I'm tempted to just skip person B and C and read what happens to person A. I agree that if an author is switching perspectives for the sake of creating artificial suspense because of an overuse of cliffhangers, that's just annoying. Suspense can definitely be added with that multiple POV perspective, but it should be added a little bit more artistically. Like when we talk about the unreliable narrators in the earlier example, just relying on cliffhangers to keep people interested does not seem to be the best way to go about writing. So we are almost done with the video, but let me just stir up some drama that I'm not involved in real quick. So I have not read all of The Wheel of Time. I've only read The Eye of the World, and I have not continued with that series. I don't know if or when I will, but there were some comments focusing on The Wheel of Time, and I found it really interesting. One commenter talked about how he felt The Wheel of Time didn't need to follow the Forsaken perspective, which is kind of like the bad guys from my interpretation. He said, "You run the risk of certain characters feeling shallow or unnecessary. For example, the Forsaken and Wheel of Time are not that interesting to me, especially because there are so many of them. The two Rivers kids are interesting and maybe Elaine is interesting too, but then all the characters feel shallow. I would say the books are about character growth and coming of age, and so there is more bickering and time spent between our main characters. The evil forces and evil people are a means to see these characters grow and change and adapt. The villains feel metaphorical and representative." Another commenter claimed that The Wheel of Time handled this really well. They said, "The Wheel of Time did this perfectly, but it was third-person limited, so that helped with clarity." And then another commenter said, "Robert Jordan is no Leo Tolstoy. The first person seemed to like some of The Wheel of Time's way of writing different perspectives, but found some of them unnecessary, even if it's being written in this third-person limited style. The second person claimed that The Wheel of Time did an amazing job, and the third person doesn't seem to like The Wheel of Time at all." So, does The Wheel of Time handle multiple perspectives well? Debate that in the comments. And also feel free to comment on anything else mentioned in this video by these different commenters as well. The discussion doesn't have to end here. Thanks for watching.